Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm reviewing the newest album from Logic, Confessions of a Dangerous Mind. Wasn't really sure what I was going to be in for listening to this record, to be honest. When it comes to a lot of Logic's more recent output, I haven't really been all too impressed with it, but at the same time I haven't really hated it either. His last couple of records, as well as the Bobby Tarantino series of mixtapes, I thought to be pretty mediocre overall, just pretty uninteresting and unmemorable. But it wasn't really until he released his last album project thing, the soundtrack for his book, Supermarket, that I feel like Logic really dropped the bad project, and a really bad project at that, because Supermarket was a pretty terrible project. I won't go into details of it because I did review it, just check that out instead. But I just will say that it is my least favorite project of the year as of now, and it very likely may still be there at the end of the year with how bad it was. The only positive coming off of that record was that this new record of his had to be better than that one, because, I mean, how could it be worse than that, really? And given some of the teaser tracks that were released from this thing leading up to it, even going back to before Supermarket's release, I didn't like any of the teaser tracks from this album. They were all better than anything off of Supermarket, so at the very least I could say that this thing was probably going to be better than that project. And yes, this is a better album than Supermarket. However, if you're ignoring Supermarket, just comparing this to all of Logic's other hip-hop projects, it's easily his worst to date. This is not a good project by any means. It's kind of interesting because it seemed like for a good period of time, Logic's career in terms of, the quality of his music was just kind of plateauing in like a downward sort of sense, if you will. Not really getting much better or worse, really, but just kind of staying at this point of mediocrity that just wasn't very interesting, but wasn't really, offensive either. Supermarket, like I said, was really bad, but that was kind of a weird left field experiment gone wrong in a sense. This project, however, just kind of feels like all the problems that Logic has had running throughout some of his more recent output has kind of like built up and just kind of imploded in on itself here on this album, as a lot of things that were, maybe minor problems on older records come up on this thing again, but in a lot larger context, and make this thing just a lot less easy to stomach overall. I will say that there are some, positives to this record, some very small ones at that. I will say that the production across this thing, for the most part, is pretty acceptable. I wouldn't say the production on this album is anything out of this world or anything, but it's acceptable enough. It sounds nicely done. It's pretty inoffensive for the most part. It's decent. They're well-made beats for the most part that Logic is given here on this thing. There are some exceptions to this, however. For example, the track Wannabe has this weird electronic beat that sounds like it's just from a different time period, like it's dated to some extent, but like not in a good way or anything, and it just doesn't fit together very nicely with the rest of the production sounds on this thing. You also have the beat towards the beginning of the track, Mama/Show Love, which kind of sounds like a bargain bin version of the track Antidote by Travis Scott, at least the beat on that track. Yeah, the production on this thing, there are some parts that I'm not the biggest fan of, but for the most part, it's easily the best section of this album. Logic's flow on this album is another part that I think is pretty solid throughout. He definitely showcased on this thing that he could still rap pretty nicely at a high technical level, and that's not enough to save the project by any means, but for the most part it's nice that he could still do that. But outside of those things, there is not a lot to enjoy here on this project, and given that I've mentioned the production and Logic's flow here on this thing, the only thing I really haven't talked about is the lyrics and the themes here on this project. And that's because the lyrics and the themes are easily the worst part of this album overall. So much so that they really drag down everything else that's going on here in this project. The lyrics on this project are just not good in the slightest, and a lot of times just come across really contradictory and don't showcase Logic in a very good light for the most part. On older projects of Logic's, I've kind of given him the benefit of the doubt at times. Sure, he's a little corny at times. Sure, he could be a little bit, too positive and uppity at times too. But, he was kind of doing his own thing, and I couldn't really hate on him for that. However, here on this project, there's so many odd contradictions that pop up in his philosophy here on this project with some of the things he says, as well as so many just odd and kind of gross things that get said as well, that the lyrics are not very good overall. And there are also a lot of moments on this thing where the lyrics are just very boring and uninteresting too. Some of the most notable, standout, kind of gross lyrics on this thing come from the title track here, where Logic seems to try to link using social media, or artists that use social media, seeing criticism on social media, and how this may lead them down the road of abusing drugs and overdosing and dying and things of that sort, which is a really crazy, large leap in logic that he makes here, no pun intended, that is kind of gross in how much it really generalizes things. I'm not going to disagree with him here on the fact that seeing criticism online might not be the best thing for some artists out there, especially if the criticism is presented in a really mean or unfair way. However, to say that that's going to lead artists automatically down the road of abusing drugs and things like that, it's a bit of a stretch overall. Yes, people should be nicer online. I agree with that sentiment. However, I don't think saying be nice to people online, because if not, they're going to abuse drugs and end up dead, that's a bit of a stretch overall. And the fact that he doesn't really explore this topic all that much and just kind of leaves it at this really big generalization is kind of concerning overall. There's also the track Pardon My Ego, which features some of the worst lyrics on this project overall. For example, he says, "I'm feeling like Kid Cudi, a little crazy, but tell me what genius ain't a little nutty," which is just really gross and disrespectful overall, considering Kid Cudi has been pretty public about battling a lot of mental issues, things like depression in the past, and Logic is here kind of using it to say that, he feels depressed, I guess, but that's okay because, in being depressed, he's kind of become a genius, or a musical genius like Kid Cudi, which is really gross overall. And it showcases that Logic doesn't really have a firm understanding on what living with these problems is like for some people, because living with something like depression, it's not a good thing. It's not a good thing to be depressed because it makes your life terrible. It doesn't make you this musical genius or something like that. Logic just comes across as one of those people who say things like a certain artist was better when they were, abusing drugs or depressed or something in their lives, when they were making better music at that time, as opposed to when they were clean and living a better life overall, in the sense that he's just kind of valuing the music over the individual and their feelings here, which is really gross. And not even just this, but a few bars later on this very same verse, he's saying things like, "I ain't bipolar, Kanye make me wish I was, 'cause the level of genius the meanest," and so on and so forth, which once again he's kind of taking something else, bipolar disorder in this case, and saying that he'd like to have something like that in order to have the creative skills of someone like Kanye West, who, once again, kind of gross how he's doing something like this. This line is also a bit more questionable, given that when Kanye was going through a lot of this bipolar stuff, or at least making it known to the public, he was also doing some pretty questionable stuff in the public, like, endorsing Trump and things like that. I'm not sure Logic is trying to say that that's what he wants to do either, but he should really, go over these lyrics a bit more, reconsider what he's actually saying here, because at the end, it's not very pretty regardless of how you look at it. It's just really gross. And considering Logic was the one who made, one of the biggest anti-suicide tracks in recent memory, back with that Suicide Number track from Everybody, it's really gross that he's saying stuff like this here on this project and not really even being self-aware of the fact that he's saying stuff that's this bad. Logic's analysis of social media and technology and things of that sort that he discusses here on this project, and how it affects things like mental illness and just people's well-being in general, comes across as really shallow throughout this project, and he seems to never really get past analyzing it beyond how he himself feels at times, which can make him come across as really self-centered a lot of time on this project. And given how all over the place and contradictory a lot of his own personal beliefs come across here on this project, it doesn't really make for a listen that's really easy to follow, or one that's really enjoyable to listen to. And mind you, it's pretty clear on this thing that he's not all over the place in a way that is supposed to be fragmented or anything like that. It just comes across as all over the place in the sense that he's just completely unaware of the fact that a lot of the stuff that he's saying is either contradictory or just doesn't really make sense when said together. A big example of this gets brought up on the track Homicide featuring Eminem, where he on this track, along with Eminem, at times go at a lot of more modern rappers, the mumble rappers, if you will, for a lot of the reasons. Lots of people don't particularly care for artists like that. The really shallow lyrical themes, the lack of a really well-defined flow, or anything like that. All of those things get made fun of here on this track at times. However, on this very same album, while Logic doesn't really let go of his really technical flow, I will give him that, there's lots of tracks on this here where he isn't really talking about anything all that deep, and at times he's talking about the same stuff that a lot of these mumble rappers talk about too, whether it be his own personal stuff, his ego, how much he's succeeded so far, his fans, things of that sort. There's lots of parts on this album where he's talking about weed as well, and not just in a sense where he's trying to cope with his own personal struggles or anything like that. At times he's just talking about it in the same way that a bajillion other rappers out there do. Logic pulls out a lot of these same topics that a lot of these mumble rappers talk about, that he's criticizing on some of the tracks here, and he's just not even self-aware of the fact that he's talking about these same things, and it's just really frustrating to listen to. It isn't helped by the fact that a lot of the features that Logic brings here on this project are artists that also really don't fit into a really lyrical category of rappers or anything like that. He's bringing artists like Wiz Khalifa and G-Eazy on this thing. And last I checked, Wiz Khalifa is best known for being a weed rapper, which, isn't particularly deep by any means. And G-Eazy, he's just a joke all around. And when Logic isn't talking about more serious subject matter on this album, or going after more modern rappers, or being completely unaware of the fact that he's talking about these same things as these rappers he tries to go after on tracks like Homicide. He's just talking about a lot of nothing that really isn't all that interesting overall. He definitely fits the bill of a rapper who has a lot of technical skill and has the ability to rap their ass off, but can't say anything for their life in the process of doing so. Tracks like Keanu Reeves on this thing, or Commando, or Out of Sight, or tracks that just see Logic going on and on and on about nothing pretty much. Sure, you have some wordplay in there and things like that. Maybe a really shallow message in there too, but they're not very enticing tracks because there's not a lot to them for me to really get hooked into. And sure, there are some corny moments that definitely pop up on this thing. It's a Logic album. What do you expect at this point? However, when the several Fortnite references that pop up on this album aren't the worst the lyrics have to offer due to some of the more serious subject matter that Logic just completely butchers on this thing, yeah, the lyrics on this album really aren't good. The features are another part of this album that I don't particularly care for. At best, they're pretty forgettable. At worst, they're really bad. Eminem's feature on Homicide is probably one of the best on the album, which is really saying something considering I don't particularly care for it all too much. He's pretty much just doing the same shtick that he's been doing since he dropped Rap God, and just saying a bunch of stuff really quickly, not saying a whole lot in the process of doing so, and just being really forgettable in the process. I really would like to see him go back to actually having some more substance in his music, but that's a discussion for another day. At the very least, I could say he does have some technical skill here on this track, and I do want to give it to Logic once again that, a lot of these songs, he does have some technical skill to him, something that G-Eazy on the track Commando does not have, and when paired up with Logic, it only makes it more obvious, because when you look at his rhyme schemes, his flow, his lyrics on this track, they're straight up garbage. When paired up with Logic, who is a pretty decent rapper overall, even if what he's saying isn't all that interesting or exciting or deep, G-Eazy still comes across as being a complete and utter joke, as I said before here on this song. The features from Gucci Mane and Wiz Khalifa and Icy and Still Ballin' respectively are some pretty underwhelming and uninteresting features overall. They're not awful or anything, but at the same time, neither feature has a lot of charisma to them or anything. They're not really all that standout. And once again, they don't have the same technical skill as Logic or anything like that. And as a result, they just don't really feel like they fit in as nicely into the track as, say, someone like Eminem did on Homicide. So yeah, these features are pretty uninteresting overall. I will give it to Will Smith on the track Don't Be Afraid to Be Different. I wasn't really expecting a whole ton from him here on this track, and while his feature isn't particularly good, I could see it kind of working in the context of this really corny track that's, trying to be corny, I think, in the right way. There are some moments on here that aren't really all that great, like the Fortnite line that he drops, but still, it's one of the better features here. I feel like his attitude and his, just his feel on the track matches up with Logic a lot better than I was expecting. As far as the hooks go throughout this album, they're pretty underwhelming once again. There are some that are okay, like on the title track, for example, or Keanu Reeves. that are, at the very least decently catchy. However, a lot of the hooks on here are, either really forgettable, like on Homicide, where it just blends into the rest of the track because both Logic and Eminem are rapping so quickly, or on a track like Icy, for example, where Logic is trying to do like this high-pitched Kendrick Lamar-like voice, kind of like what he was doing on Goosebumps, but nowhere near as good. It just sounds kind of odd, and it makes the hook really annoying. Overall, the hooks on this album are nothing to write home about. And this album as a whole is one that, I don't really enjoy overall, if it's not, apparent by this point. Like I said, the beats on here for the most part are pretty okay. Logic's flow throughout this thing is pretty solid as well. You do have a couple of features on here where, maybe some of the stuff that they bring to the table I could see working in maybe a bit of a different context. However, it's really the lyrics and the themes here on this album that drags this whole thing down, because whereas on older Logic projects or some of his more recent output that was not Supermarket, his lyrics were either a bit more forgettable overall, or maybe occasionally he'd sneak in some interesting storytelling or some grander concepts into there that were kind of interesting. Here on this project, what he chooses to tackle isn't necessarily a terrible topic, but the way he addresses it just completely deconstructs his own personal persona and ideology in a way that I don't think he was trying to do, and kind of exposes it to be not really all that solidly grounded, as, despite the fact that Logic has this really upbeat, positive message in his music, he isn't, afraid to make fun of other rappers, particularly some of the mumble rappers out there, if it's, for his own ego or something like that, despite the fact that on this same project, he'll do things like advocate for people being nicer to each other on the internet and things of that sort. These contradictions are all over this project in Logic's own messages, and it just makes dissecting what's going on here uglier and uglier the more you dig into it, and just really unpleasant to listen to. And Logic just comes across as so unlikable at the end of this project. On his previous efforts, while I wasn't really the biggest fan of them, I could say at the very least that Logic was, at least a little bit likable, if not a little bit corny. But on this project, he's not likable in the slightest overall. It's just like everything that he's done prior on some of his more recent output that was working, he just decided to strip that away for the most part, leaving the worst of what he was doing before. And the results are a really bad album, in my opinion. Not as bad as Supermarket by any means. This is definitely more in Logic's lane, and it's pretty apparent given the production and choices when it comes to his flows and deliveries here on the tracks. But everything else here, the features, the occasionally some of the beats as well, the subject matter most importantly, it all isn't very good. So unless you're some kind of diehard Logic fan or anything like that, don't listen to this project. I'm sure if you are a diehard Logic fan, you already have heard this project, and you probably haven't made it this far into the review at this point. So if you have, thank you for watching. And regardless if you're a Logic diehard fan or not, thank you for watching. This album wasn't for me. I didn't enjoy it. Logic fans, maybe you'll enjoy it, but if you're not a Logic fan, you haven't liked him in the past, you won't enjoy this. But with that said, it is just my own personal opinion. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own opinion in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure to leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content. Things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. If you like that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.